Grove. I'm a doctoral student at Columbia University and a guest researcher at Sorbonne Université Celsa. And I'm here to take you through a photo exhibition by Daniel Latif in the Mairie de la 17e. Thank you for joining me. Okay, so something to think about when we think about portraits, right, is that right now, so almost since the beginning of photography, portraits have been something that's circulated, right? There's something that we exchange, there's something almost like a kind of currency. From the carte de visite straight through to the kind of snapshot to Snapchat, it's a currency. So, and it's mobile, and it's always on these very small sort of locket-shaped things. So what happens if we take that kind of perpetually intangible exchange and put it in an older context of portraiture, which is the state portrait, right? So what is a state portrait? It is, how to put it? It's a representation of a person in their context, in their sort of imperial context. In what they have dominion over. So you imagine me standing here, and my feet are on a map of the country that I rule, my hand is on a globe, I'm holding a scepter. Or I am a scientist, like the famous portrait of Lavoisier in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, right? I'm sitting down, I'm doing science, there's a lot of blown glass at my feet. I am present with the representation of what I do, and this is a statement about who I am. And when you put a portrait like that in a space like this, in a space like a city hall, then you are making a reciprocal statement about the power and the presence of the model in the portrait and the space that it's in. So for example, in my home institution, Columbia, there is a big portrait in the law school of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She is in her judicial robes, fully done, and there's a sort of reciprocal exchange of status between the portrait and the space. You look at it as a student and you say, oh my gosh, that person was here, I too am here, we have a mutual relationship, and there's a claim being made for both people. So the context of that kind of image is extremely important. So what does it mean then, when we look at these images, to have them here in City Hall? What we have here is someone who is working in multiple traditions of portraiture and playing games with it in very interesting ways. So let's start with three images that are particularly interesting. This one, and that one. What seems to be happening here is we are looking at protagonists in a movie that we've never seen before. They look like cinema stills, right? This could be a 1980s movie. This could be a dystopian film. This could be the hero in an adventure. This could be, there are all kinds of stories we could come up with for this one. But in all of these, both their size and their context, they suggest a story that we aren't being told, but which we can imagine. Which immediately suggests a reference to the work of Cindy Sherman and her early work spectacular early work in the 1980s of cinema stills for movies that never existed. If we turn to another shot here, another portrait, this one is very interesting because this suggests a film, a different film, a 1940s film. We've got the bicycle, we've got the hat, we've got the glasses, we've got an almost timeless uniform. Because one of the things that's interesting when you look at the history of costume is that the costume for men has changed much less than the costume for women. So this shot is timeless. This could be really almost any moment in the 20th century. This could be a movie, so we can actually see when these different movies were made, right? So this can be a movie from any time from the 1940s to the present day. This is a movie from the 1980s. This is, I'd say, a movie from any time in the last 20 years. In all cases, we have a sort of protagonist gaze, a point of view gaze. Now, returning to what I was talking about before involving the state portrait, in which you have with you sort of the accoutrement of your status, and it's represented. This picture is particularly interesting in this context, because if you imagine me as a person of state, right, my hand on the globe, or my scientific instruments, or my book, what this person's object of significance is a cake. But the cake is out of focus. Okay, so returning to this image, we have discussed it in relationship to the state portrait, right, in which we say, what does it mean to have the signifier of identity and status be blurry? What we've not discussed is the size, right? Size matters. One of the things that people remarked on when they talk about the silver screen, when they talk about cinema, is just how big everybody's heads were. When we want to talk about a big personality, we say they're larger than life. And given that our relationship to this kind of image is, when we exchange it, is usually on something about this size, what does it mean when we make it this big? And what does it mean also when we have, and what is also being played with here is simultaneously the question of the state portrait and the enormously altered relationship to food and the images of food that we have had post-Instagram. Because how many pictures have we not had that erase the person, that erase the face entirely and just focus on the hands? There are now entire genres that are simply about the materiality of food, and food as a visual thing, in which we remove the person altogether. So this is not only we're making an interesting reference to the state portrait, but it is refusing the visual rhetoric of Instagram on food. So this is a very interesting portrait and should certainly be seen in relationship to this one. Here, there are a number of things going on, and here what I would like to talk about primarily is color. Look at the color contrast between this, and this. And this is a theme that we are going to see later on in some other portraits, which involves what seems to be a deliberate use of contrast and shapes, in which if we even remove the person's face as an image and just deal with these squares, we get an entirely different kind of conversation that's about visual design. We can also look at this and debate which part of this should be the focus. Because whereas in this image, there's a clear claim that it's the face. In this one, our attention is slightly split. The primary focus is the face, but you can still see enough here to try to sort of puzzle out what this dish is. This is a sort of dual opportunity to pay attention. There's also a position of offering here, which seems to me to be a reference to a famous work by Marina Abramović, in which she is standing with a bowl with a cup of a bowl of milk that is perpetually spilling over, and it is a visual installation on loop in which she appears to be permanently offering the viewer this bowl of milk that is always spilling over. So in that case, when we see this work in this space, when we talk about its relationship to art that's in a gallery, moving to talking about design, is the idea of the tough guy in bloom. Because what we see here is a sort of this floral pattern here, and these multiple colors of the letters is a sort of enjoyable image of a very verdant, fertile, blooming environment, which plays very nicely with the notion of the tough guy. What does that mean in this context? The conversation we've primarily been having about this group of photos is not only a question about the state portrait, but also the protagonists of movies we've never seen. And if we can choose to see this entirely as an image about design, or we can again see this as a protagonist of a film we haven't seen. We can see this confrontationally. And this also could be the protagonist of a film we haven't seen, and there are a number of characters it could be. We could be looking at anyone from Robert De Niro to like the wholesome baker who's the uncle of the love interest. There are any number of characters that this kind of shot could produce. This image is particularly interesting. We've talked about it in relationship to Cindy Sherman's work, but we can also talk about it as a representation of the current moment and of the pandemic. Because what do we have here? We have the wine glass the phone, and the mask. If we are talking about what's present in a photo and what kinds of status claims it makes about a person, this particular assemblage is a very familiar one from this historical moment. And this kind of face, this kind of like kind of experience is very much the experience that we have had. So it is perfectly possible to see this not only as an art object, but as a journalistic representation, which is sort of, how to put it, a distillation of a particular moment in time and a particular approach to a global plague. Because someone who was seeing this from 2015 wouldn't really know what that was, right? It's a little bit out of focus. It could be a napkin. It's not a surgeon. This is not a place for a surgeon to be. What is that doing there? So I think we can do a lot with these sort of objects that we think of as the objects of a cafe plus that is something that really sums up a particular historical moment. I would like to bring this in because this particular image is important in the context of how we are displaying these other portraits. Because we are hanging, because this is a classical portrait of a certain type. It is a state portrait of the kind that we are talking about. And it is a state portrait in a way that's intended to be reproduced, but reproduced both physically and electronically, right? You can print these by the gazillion. But it still has the state regalia. So to put these other images in a room with it is to suggest that they are images of the same kind. And as we move over here, we're going to look at ways in which the sort of visual rhetoric of the politician is present. Look at this. This could be somebody running for office. It has, and what's interesting here is that we are not only using, we're using the visual rhetoric of the politician and we are adapting it for, in the context of a woman, which is relatively recent, because there's just less, we have less of a history of composing electoral images of women running for office. But this has many of those signs. The blurred background, the sort of indistinct place, could be in the city, could be in the country, the restrained jewelry, the smile, the statesman-like expression. This would work perfectly in the context of a mayoral election. We can also look at this in terms of as an image in terms of design. As we can see the photo, we can see the green here of the jacket being echoed in the green there. We can see the fall of the light. We can see the gold in the hair and the earrings being echoed with the sunlight. Like as a piece of design, it's also very elegant. And we also need to look at the lines in the coat and how they echo the lines in what appears to be a railway. And when I'm talking about the rhetoric of electability, I'm also talking specifically about this shape, this V-shaped suit, which when we discussed earlier that picture over there, we talked about how male costume hasn't changed very much in the last 150 years. This is an adaptation of that particular shape of the late 19th, early 20th century leisure suits, the shooting jacket, which becomes adapted into the men's everyday suit wear. And what's interesting is that we can compare this shape right here to this shape right here, right? What are we doing with these two V shapes that have been positioned right next to each other, but are doing entirely different work? Because this is working within the rhetoric of an election, and this is working within sort of, how to put it, this could be the kind of photo that you would get in the wedding announcements of the New York Times as the portrait of the groom. It is the same, it's the same V shape of the male costume, but it's in a brighter color, there are flowers, and this is again something that's very interesting in terms of its use of color and echoes the same confidence of the use of color in the portrait of the man who has which is to say, let's look at echoes. This is in effect a man in the green, which is why it would be so suitable for a wedding portrait. We have the literal flowers here, the representation of the flowers there, and this design, which appears to be a paisley, but also has the same kind of sort of sort of symbology of growth that we see expressed more ironically in the picture of the man with the Hawaiian shirt. So, yes, and also that hat. That is a hat which represents leisure, which is very different from the hat in that man. It comes from the same sort of heritage, but it has a different symbolic meaning than the hat over there, which is more a city hat. The Panama versus the fedora. Oh, and I don't think I've talked, have I talked about the use of color here? The blue, how the blues and the reds and the greens all work together to make it sort of a design object. And again, we're talking about the 1980s here in a different way than we're talking about the 1980s in what I would describe as the shot from the movie that never existed, in the image over there. And in this case, what we're talking about is the kind of brilliant 1980s color maximalism, the supersaturation of color. So as a design object, if we even remove the notion of it as a portrait, this one is very interesting. All right, so let's talk about the conventions of journalism, which is the kind of thing we're talking about here. I mentioned for that one that we're talking about a portrait in the New York Times for a wedding day. This is the portrait as journalistic profile, right? This is the shot of Muhammad Ali. This is the shot of the great writer surrounded by his works and blurs. This is the shot of the great musician. These are all photos from the New York Style section. It is another kind of portraiture, and it is again an interesting claim to put them in the space of the City Hall, because usually this kind of photo, although carefully composed and part of a public relations strategy, is also ephemeral. And to put it in a City Hall is to make a different kind of claim about the permanence of journalistic work. This one I find particularly interesting as a composition. So what we're given to us, so what we see here is a portrait of a dancer, is it? Yes, okay. And so what's interesting about this is, first of all, we can see it in the light of the conversations we've been having about protagonists in movies we've never seen. And we can certainly imagine this as a hero in a dystopia. But if we want to, rather than interpreting it that way, if we want to see this purely as a visual composition, there are some really interesting things happening with light and with lines. So let's look at this shape, right? It's coming out from his head like a star. It's coming out as if it were a halo. But what kind of halo is this? Who is this saint? This is the saint of the metro, right? He has a halo made of tile. He's the hero. He is a god of the underground. And we have light coming directly out of his head. So there is a claim that could potentially be made here about center in his head, which would still fit well with a dystopian movie, but would also make a very nice claim about this individual as a dancer. If we look at the lines here, let us imagine that this part of the image is completely gone, and we just have these lines. Look at the way that the lines go up here, and then are echoed by that. And consider the way that the texture of this knitting is echoed by the blurred texture of the tile. So you also get this idea that he is not only radiating, this is not only sort of a halo for him of the underground, but he is also in some way either composed of it or armored in it. Then, if we look at the hands, the angle of the hands here are really beautiful, and they suggest a kind of contained power. And if we understand this person as a dancer whose work consists of a combination of stasis and movement, because I'm given to understand that he's a person who does his dance work without moving his feet, we can see a lot of that represented here, because we have this beautiful image of static shapes, and then we have this lovely arc of the wrists here, which we can see suggests a lot of contained physical power. And then we have this wonderful extension, which is brightly colored and spotted, in a way which we could easily interpret as representing sort of the messiness, the colorful messiness of movement. So there are a number of ways to read this image and to interpret it. And one of the things that I think is wonderful about this exhibition, and why I have not referred to any portrait by name, is that I am experiencing it entirely without captions. none of these people are named, which is what gives us this kind of freedom to interpret them as protagonists of imaginary movies, as Muhammad Ali, as compositions that are purely about design and don't involve people at all, as comments on Instagram. It is the absence of captions and their presence in a city hall which gives us this kind of freedom of interpretation. So there would be an entirely different curatorial approach you could take, which would be to compel different kinds of interpretation of these images. But that's not what the curator and the installer have chosen to do, which is what allows us to have this, what allows us to have this kind of sort of imagistic play with what the portrait signifies in this context.